In today's Platform to Perform vlog, I'm going to be discussing considerations for the youth female athlete. Now, you may be wondering what makes youth athletes different to adult athletes, apart from the obvious. And the first thing to note is that they are not miniature adults. You can't just water down a strength and conditioning program for an adult and expect this to work with a child in the same way, not just for physiological reasons, but obviously psychosocial reasons as well. But in terms of specifically talking about youth female athletes, the first thing to consider is their anatomy. Now, prior to puberty, youth male and youth female athletes are effectively the same thing. However, once puberty kicks in, and obviously the influx of hormones means that girls' hips will start to widen as their body prepares for its childbearing capabilities. Now, the significance of this is that it increases something called the Q angle. Now, the Q angle is the line of pull from the outside of the pelvis, or the anterior superior iliac spine, drawn all the way through to the middle of the patella. Now, the larger this angle is, the greater the lateral pull on the patella. So there's more likelihood of the kneecap being pulled sideways. Now, this in itself can predispose youth female athletes to a greater incidence of knee injuries, and this is why anterior cruciate ligament injuries are a lot more common in youth female athletes compared to their male counterparts. And so what might this mean for a training program for a youth female athlete? Well, this might mean that you're going to spend longer in, for example, the landing phase of a plyometric program. It means that you may well have to revisit this landing phase, and that the posterior chain versus the strength of the muscles around the knee might be affected, which we'll go into in greater detail on the coming slide. The next thing to note is the significance of the difference in the timing of the growth spurt between youth male and youth female athletes. Now, girls typically enter their growth spurt slightly earlier than boys, and the reason why this is important is because what typically happens as children grow is their bones grow first, and then what happens is, because the muscles and tendons catch up much later, they are put on a bit more of a stretch. The muscles and tendons become more taut, which again can increase the risk of injuries, especially if volume of training is not monitored and adapted carefully. This may mean that as youth female athletes are going through their growth spurt, especially if it's quite noticeable and affecting movement patterns, that volume needs to be taken down a bit just whilst they're going through this phase. Movement might deteriorate, and this is simply because the youth female athlete is trying to get themselves used to moving a larger frame, a longer frame, and potentially a heavier frame. So you're also probably going to see decrements in measures such as VO2 max, which is done relative to body weight, and equally in terms of strength in relation to body weight. This is why strength training for girls is, in my opinion, even more important than boys. Typically, obviously, as female and male hormones kick in, the difference between strength levels between boys and girls gets drastically different. So if you've not already got your youth female athlete or your daughter strength training before puberty, it's probably going to make their life a little bit more difficult introducing it after or even during, because coordination might be affected. Again, not to say it affects every female youth athlete, but there is obviously a potential for this to happen. Another thing that's really interesting is the relationship between the strength of the quadriceps at the front of the leg and the strength of the hamstrings at the back of the leg. A paper by Myers et al. 2009 found that as girls go through puberty, their quadriceps strength continues to increase, but hamstrings don't quite follow suit. And again, what this means is this predisposes youth female athletes to injuries, and it may mean that you want to focus a little bit more of your attention on posterior chain exercises. So deadlift variations, hip thrusts, stuff like that. Again, it's not to say don't train the quadriceps, but just to say be mindful that this happens. So you need to be aware of that when it comes to your programming. And finally, of course, as we've mentioned, as the youth female athlete's body is preparing for potentially childbirth, ligaments get looser, or increase in laxity. So this is another reason why you need to be on it when it comes to assessing their landing mechanics. And again, don't be afraid to take them back to the beginning of establishing these landing mechanics. In the previous slide, you saw a video of a gymnast landing with a knee dominant landing strategy as her knees were shoved forward. Now, this is another thing to note, because obviously gymnastics is likely to be a sport that girls might be participating in, and a hip dominant strategy where the hips are sat back is preferred in terms of reducing stress on the knee. Equally, if you've got a youth female athlete who's going through a huge growth spurt and the muscles and tendons are tightening because the bones have lengthened and we're still waiting for these to catch up, that if they may have previously been able to tolerate a knee dominant strategy, now the same volume of training is arguably going to be even more stressful because they're moving a heavier frame, a larger frame, and with the increased Q angle, we're probably more likely to see an increase in knee valgus. So this is when the knees are coming together, and again, this increases stress around the patella. Now, this is an analogy I quite like in terms of encouraging youth female athletes into strength training and movement training before the growth spurt hits. Now, picture the scenario. If you've never had a driving lesson in your life, and now you learn in a massive Range Rover which has a massive engine, and even with my poor car knowledge, let's just assume it goes from 0 to 60 pretty well. Now, if you've never driven before, this is a massive step up to take. You're now controlling a larger vehicle, a more powerful vehicle, and it's a bit awkward to coordinate in terms of your awareness of how well it does in space. Now, on the other hand, a more ideal strategy, and this is what I would liken to learning efficient movement patterns. So for example, how to squat, how to jump, how to land, how to be able to hinge the hips backwards, and not, for example, round your back in hip bending patterns. So if you've done that, i.e. you've learned to drive in a Mini before you learn to drive in a big Range Rover, you're going to find that transition a lot easier. Again, if you're teaching a youth female athlete or your daughter how to move their own body weight and develop strength in their own body weight, it's going to be much easier to then transition to using a larger, a longer and heavier frame than it would be if the first time your daughter encounters movement training, that if that first time is when they've got this heavier frame where they may lose a bit of coordination, then that's the equivalent of starting your driving lessons 70 miles an hour on the motorway in a massive Range Rover. Again, we've already mentioned of ligaments becoming more lax as well, so this is another reason why it's really important for young girls to be able to control their own body weight before puberty hits, rather than having to worry about it after. And of course, an obvious thing which perhaps doesn't get anywhere near as much traction as it should is the menstrual cycle. Now, the menstrual cycle and the hormones that go with it have been shown to affect strength gains. Interestingly, VO2 max or performance indicators such as VO2 max and lactate threshold, they seem to remain relatively constant throughout the cycle, so throughout the menstrual cycle. So you can still achieve personal bests if you're in endurance sports. However, if you're in sports that involve reaction time or neuromuscular coordination or manual dexterity, this is when it's going to be harder to keep your head in the game because of the hormonal fluctuations. Also important to note that one size does not fit all, and that it is highly individual. So again, the analogy I would say is it's a small rock in comparison to other factors, but still worth bearing in mind. Interestingly, female athletes have been found to generally be stronger and tolerate more volume in the follicular phase. So this is the first week of menstruation compared to the luteal phase, where we're looking at being a couple of weeks away from menstruation. But as I said, highly individual and not necessarily worth planning a whole cycle on. However, it's super important, especially for male coaches, and this is something I don't think receives enough attention. Super important for male coaches to have that effective working relationship with female athletes, to be able to have these conversations with youth athletes and parents, and to understand what works best for that athlete. For some, it might just be, I don't feel great today, I need to just do a bit of foam rolling stretching. Again, for others, it might be that you've got an open enough relationship to say, you know what, maybe we don't push it this week if you're not feeling great. To me, it shouldn't be any different to, for example, understanding an athlete's sleep patterns. So for example, if they've not slept all night and on the program I've got them going into some heavy strength and power training, is this really the right time to be pushing them? Again, this is why that coach-athlete relationship is so important, and it's also important to have a flexible program that is not just seen as, oh, well, I've written these sets and reps down a few weeks ago now, so that's what we're doing. It needs to be a flexible coach-athlete relationship, absolutely critical as ever. And another important consideration is coaching implications. Now, important to state that this is not the case for all female athletes. This is simply my experience. There are of course going to be female athletes who are exceptions rather than the rule, but this is just my own anecdotal observations from working with youth female athletes. Now, the first one to note is that male and female drivers of motivation tend to be different. Now, interestingly, when I went to a CPD event with a psychologist called Kate Hayes, she presented findings from her PhD, and one of the things I found really interesting was she interviewed elite male and female athletes. Now, one of the female athletes she interviewed was top 3 in the world for her sport, and in the interview she was saying stuff like how she felt so big compared to the other competitors and how they were stick insects and she felt fat. Now, she was from a sport that almost certainly would have benefited from that extra size, from being strong and powerful. Yet here she was on a world stage, not thinking about her performance, but thinking about how the way that the other girls looked made her feel. So important to note that as a male coach, it's easy for, especially if you've only worked with male athletes, it's easy to get caught up in things that you don't think have an impact, but 100% worth considering. For example, in the previous school I worked at, some girls didn't like the fact that there were mirrors in there because they didn't want to be able to see themselves. So the little things arguably matter a lot more. And again, interestingly, another finding from her PhD was that female athletes tend to gain confidence from seeing their competitors make mistakes. Now, again, not saying this is all female athletes, but really interesting stuff nonetheless. And finally, female athletes have a lot of things that take away from their confidence that don't seem to appear in male athletes. Again, going back to the body imagery issues, again, can definitely affect male athletes, but in the research she was quoting, didn't seem as prominent. So you've almost got to, especially as a male coach, you've almost got to be even more attuned and emotionally intelligent to what's going on in your sessions, and not just what you're communicating, but how you're communicating it. She also found that for male athletes, it seemed more important that their coach had been there and done it, and that relationship between the male athlete and coach wasn't necessarily as important as knowing that the coach had been there and done it. Now, of course, this is a generalization. However, interestingly, for female athletes, that relationship between coach and athlete seemed even more important. And interestingly, one of the things she mentioned was that the female athletes that she interviewed liked it when their coach noticed individual aspects about them. And another important difference is difference in fiber type composition. Now, the two pictures on the board on the presentation, you'd be forgiven for not knowing who the bottom lad is, and that is a Australian lad called Jack Hale, who has a 100-meter time at 16 that is better than the female world record. Now, what this shows is the difference in fiber type composition between male and female athletes. Female athletes tend to, although not all the time, tend to be more slower twitch dominant than their male counterparts. They are eccentrically stronger than men. What that means is that they can lower much more weight relative to their 1 rep maximum compared to male athletes, and also seemingly for some reason don't get as sore as their male counterparts. So for example, if you're doing something like a chin up lower, so you jump up, hold the bar, and then just slowly lower under control, they'll probably get away with a lot more volume than their male counterparts, so they recover faster. Maybe this is because they're more slow twitch dominant. Maybe this is just because they can't innovate motor units the same way male athletes can. And finally, to summarize these coaching implications, relationships for me are even more critical, and the menstrual cycle should not be a taboo subject. Again, still think this is something that a lot of male coaches, again myself included, could do with a lot more either education on, or just some, especially working in a school environment where there's a whole host of safeguarding issues. It's important that it doesn't become a subject that gets swept under the carpet. Again, if it's going to affect an athlete's mood or their performance, and you're writing a training program off that, for me, that conversation just has to be had, as much to keep the athlete safe, because you're imposing a bigger stress on them than what needs to happen if they're at certain stages of their menstrual cycle. Again, highly individual, but also just so you can change things if you absolutely need to. And the next thing to talk about is what's best for the group. So in my experience, I found that youth female athletes tend to love that group side of things a lot. They almost need it a lot more. So for example, I noticed that doing stuff like loaded carries, so suitcase carries, farmers walks, the girls that I worked with didn't seem to like that. Of course, it's understandable that young girls perhaps don't want calluses on their hands. I mean, some boys don't as well, but still. So tactical exercise substitutions, such as, for example, wheelbarrow carries with a partner. I quite like suitcase carry holds using your partner and holding their leg on one side, because then the partner who's working on the bottom of the press-up position, they're working anti-rotation because they've got to avoid their hips dropping on one side. Equally, the partner doing the carrying has to avoid lateral flexion on the side that they're holding their partner. The side they're trying to resist holding their partner on. And also, what I found was they might think nothing of holding half their partner's body weight, which might be, I don't know, 30, 40 kilos, but you give them a 16 kilo kettlebell and that's all of a sudden too hard. So just being tactical about these switches and thinking, what is the physical adaptation that I want? Is there a way that I can get this whilst keeping everybody happy? And in terms of programming implications, as I said, you can't control something like the menstrual cycle, and it's worth focusing on what you can control. So for me, I found that volume is king, and as I said, female athletes tend to recover a lot quicker. My personal opinion is I would much rather a female athlete do something like 3 sets of 15 bent leg inverted rows than say 3 sets of 5 banded chin-ups, because the upper body in female athletes, especially after puberty, just naturally has a lot less muscle mass than male counterparts. The fact that they can recover from more volume anyway, you might as well take advantage of that. Posterior chain, as I said, might require a little bit more focus, because the relationship or the ratio between quadricep strength and hamstring strength when girls go through puberty seems to be a lot more biased towards the quadriceps. However, don't confuse quad dominance for strong quads. They are not the same thing. Just because someone has stronger quads than their hamstrings does not mean they have strong quads. Female athletes are still going to need strong quadriceps in terms of being able to control the movement of the knee. We've already spoken about how ligaments get increase in laxity as their body prepares for childbirth, so you need to build up as much strength around that knee to the muscles that are going to support it as you can. So hamstrings, quadriceps, glutes, make sure all of those are being strengthened as part of your program using hip hinge movements and squat patterns and single leg work. Absolutely hammer single leg work. And again, finally, landings might require more of an emphasis, because the Q angle, or the difference between the outside of the pelvis and the knee, means that there's more likelihood for that knee to get pulled from side to side. So if you need to revisit landings because you're starting to see the movement deteriorate, then that's what you need to do. And finally, most importantly for female athletes, start movement training earlier. This means that, for me, the best time for young girls to learn how to squat, to learn how to jump, to learn how to land, to develop strength in these movement patterns with their own body weight is pre-puberty. As I said with the analogy with going from the Mini to the Range Rover, let them get used to developing strength and good quality movement in a smaller, lighter and easier to control vehicle, i.e. pre-puberty, than waiting until they get larger, heavier. They're possibly going to lose confidence if, for example, they find that their fitness is dropping simply because they're heavier or their strength to weight ratio has gone down. And so really you need to get youth female athletes strong before puberty kicks in, so that if, for example, their strength to weight ratio is here, then by the time puberty kicks in, and if you're continuing to get stronger throughout this phase, you might not get any stronger, but if you're, you might not get any stronger relative to body weight, but if your strength goes up and your weight goes up as well, then at least your strength to weight ratio is staying where it needs to be, and you're still going to have more of a chance to be able to control your body in time and space. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Todd Davidson of P2P Coaching. If you have any questions on any topics related to youth athletic development, or just want to get in touch, then my details are on the screen, and I hope you found this useful. Catch you again in the next episode.